Hey, hope you're well. In this one, I'm going to take a look at this router bit that looks more like a medieval instrument of torture. I've never seen anything quite like this before, and there's lots to say about it. But before we do, let's get this bit spinning and see how it cuts. I've been making some more oak-fronted drawers for the workshop, and I used the little Bosch 12-volt track saw to cut everything to size in a previous video. So all that's left for me to do are the fascias. I've made another handle template that's just a little bit bigger to give more clamping or taping area. And it also has an offcut of the oak fascia fitted as the fence. This is the same thickness as the drawer fronts, obviously, as I like to use the ends of the fence to help prevent tear out in the workpiece. I've used the template to mark the handle positions in the usual way. See the previous video if you want the detailed story on that. And then I've cut close to the line with the jigsaw to take out most of the waste. This bit is only for bench-mounted machinery, so I'm working face down with the template stuck to the back of the drawer front with double-sided tape. I could just pin the template in place, but there's plenty of surface area for the tape to give a good hold, and I'm giving it a bit of extra pressure with a one-handed squeeze clamp all around the edges. The bit is a 24 by 50mm double bearing flush cut trimmer, and I've adjusted the height so the top bearing just bears against the template and the top tip of the cutter just above the thickness of the oak. As a precaution, I've dialed back the speed on the AUK motor to a little under half speed, and then we can carefully introduce the workpiece to the bit, and you do not want to be getting into a climbing cut situation with a bit like this. First cut done, and it's looking extremely clean. I can prise the template off the workpiece eventually. That double-sided tape is good stuff. And then it's rinse and repeat for the two remaining oak drawer fronts. Okay, so these are some of the cleanest cuts in 21mm thick oak that I've ever seen, to give you some idea of how hard this wood is. When I was fixing the fence to the template, I thought I could staple it in place, but the staples hit some kind of block, some kind of extra density in the oak that sort of bent them sideways, and I ended up having to screw the fence on instead. So as I said at the start, I've never seen anything quite like this in a router bit before, but Graham, the forum mod at 10-Minute Workshop Plus, spotted it alongside some other interesting router bits that he'd picked up. So I bought this one as much out of interest as anything. We've seen how it cuts. Let's have a chat about what it does, what the benefits are, why you might want to use it, and why you might not want to use it as well. So this is a double bearing flush trimming bit, but with helical or spiral cutting tips that can be turned through 90 degrees or replaced. Some of the more costly planers or jointers have helical cutting heads like this, but this is the first time I've seen this approach in a router bit. Router bits are usually pretty simple pieces of tooling, a shank that's held in the collet of the router, and a cutting edge or flute, more often two, that's the business end. A straight cutter like this is about as simple as it gets. You buy one that's the right size for the work you're doing and the right size for your router. You use it till it gets blunt and then you sharpen it or replace it. There are also bearing guided bits that have a bearing that limits the extent of their sideways movement. A bottom guided bit, sometimes called a panel trimmer, has a bottom bearing below the cutting flutes, and it's used where you're trimming a surface to the edge of a panel, laminate trimming, edge banding, veneer trimming, etc., where the bearing bears against the panel and the surface is trimmed flush to fit. A top bearing bit has the bearing mounted on the shank above the cutting flutes, also known as a template trimmer for obvious reasons. Because the bearing is at the top, you can also use this bit for non-through cuts like handle recesses, though you do need to pay attention to the thickness of the material, the template and the length of the bit. There are also double bearing cutters, flush trimmers like this one, that have both a top and bottom bearing and can perform both functions, and I typically use one of these, this trend one, when I'm doing handle cutouts. It's a 19mm diameter by 50mm long, and it costs around £50, $60 or thereabouts. Now, because router cutters have an edge, and like all cutting tools, they can get blunt with use, router bits can be sharpened, but when you sharpen them, the size changes slightly. With a normal router bit, that doesn't matter too much because you're usually making several passes, so slight adjustments can be made. But with a bearing guided bit like this, a sharpened bit won't be the same size as the bearing, so you won't get a flush cut anymore. And this is where router cutters with replaceable tips or blades come into their own, because you can replace the blades without changing the size of the cut. Of course, those bits are usually more costly than a standard bit. As I said earlier, this trend double flush trimmer is about £50, $60, but a 19mm template bit with a replaceable tip is more than double that, and the replacement tips alone cost almost as much as this entire bit. For comparison, this monster 24 by 50mm bit was £81, almost exactly $100, including shipping to the UK and with a spare set of tips. So you can see the obvious economic advantages of something like this, and that's before you factor in the fact that you can rotate each tip through 90 degrees to give you 4 new cutting edges for each set of tips. So economics aside, what are the practical benefits of this approach? Well, in a planer or jointer, a spiral cutting block makes sense because they're often 10 or 12 inches wide. Nick a standard planer blade on a particularly tough knot or a bit of shrapnel, and you've got to change the whole blade. With a spiral block, you can just swap out or turn the individual cutting tip. But with just 50mm, 2 inches of router bit, that seems a lot less important to me. Spiral blocks in planers where only one tip is in contact with the work at any time means they're also quieter, but again, that's a lot less of a big deal on a router where 50mm is a big cutter, and a lot of the time you're working with much thinner stock than that. The shavings they make are definitely smaller. Smaller blades make smaller shavings, obviously, so extraction should be better with these, or at least a little easier to manage. But then smaller shavings also mean more of them, so there's that to consider as well. And finally, there's the elephant in the room, health and safety. Yeah, let's talk about BSEN 847-1, limited cutter projection tooling, sometimes called chip limiter tooling. I'll link the relevant HSE document in the description below. I've read it through several times, and I'm honestly still none the wiser about how it relates to router bits, because all the language references industrial spindle molder tooling. If you don't know who they are, the Health and Safety Executive is Britain's national regulator for workplace health and safety. Yes, workplace health and safety. Their entire remit is to maintain health and safety in the workplace in commercial environments, which is why all the video that I've shown here today of this cutter being used was shot by me in my personal hobby workshop at the weekend, not in a commercial environment. So if you're a hobby woodworker, or if you're not in Britain, then you can make up your own minds as to whether something like this bit is for you. But if you do run a commercial workshop, and let's be honest, commercial shops are the ones most likely to reap the benefits of a bit like this. If you do run a commercial workspace, then have a read of the HSE documentation down below and let me know in the comments if you think it applies. For all those reasons, I won't be linking to this bit at all. They are widely available if you search for them. I purchased mine from a company called Find Buy Tool. Google them if you're interested. They run an American-looking website with a Shopify back-end and payment processing, but they are in fact Chinese and shipped direct from China. I make no judgment in that. I mention it for information only, and the goods I ordered arrived in about a week with no issues whatsoever. The bit appears to be very good quality, and they do supply recommended torque settings for it for when you're replacing or rotating the tips, which is comforting. Even so, I did a spin-up test with the bit surrounded by those tough oak floorboards whilst I was hiding under the bench. And with a vision like that, I'll call this one done for now. Thanks so much for taking a look, and I'll see you all again very soon. All right, take care.